Hi everyone, my name is Alviana and I will be talking about social influence on LGBTQ rights today. So I want to start with a history briefly. Alfred Kinsley was a big historical figure because he conducted research where he interviewed 8,000 men with questions about the range of their sexuality, and he concluded that sexuality falls on a spectrum between homosexual and heterosexual instead of it just being confined or condensed to the two categories. This is one of the initial factors that inspired a fight for change. Being openly gay was considered lewd behavior in the 1960s and early 70s, so police would often raid gay bars with authorization from the city to shut down establishments with no actual justification. Cafeteria Compton and the Stonewall Uprising are examples of organized aggressive riots against the police, which sparked even more protesting. Continuously rising and vigorous political activism resulted in LGBTQ members opening businesses and churches run by them, welcoming them. Same-sex activity became legalized in 2003. Gay people were allowed to openly serve in the military in 2010, and same-sex marriage finally was legalized in 2015. So, of course, there was backlash against LGBTQ members and the movement in general. As businesses and churches were beginning to open by members of the LGBTQ community, violence against its members began emerging. Many gay men would be targeted and beat up on the streets when being open about their sexuality. A bar converted into a church called the Upstairs Lounge was set on fire by an arsonist and targeted in New Orleans in 1973, which resulted in many deaths of LGBTQ members inside. Many of us remember the Pulse nightclub shooting because of how recent it was, but if you don't, it was a gay club in Orlando, also targeted in 2016, which also resulted in many deaths. These are only some of the tragedies the LGBTQ community has faced, mind you. The AIDS epidemic emerged among the LGBTQ community in the 1980s and was originally falsely identified as gay-related immune deficiency by media, doctors, and public health authorities, which further outcast the LGBTQ community from the rest of society, as this became another reason why they didn't belong and shouldn't be allowed to explore freely in some people's minds. The triangle symbol in the picture, in the banner behind the people standing here, it was the symbol used to spread awareness of the AIDS epidemic and call for research for the virus. So one would question, why was there so much pushback or opposition against LGBTQ rights? And the answer to that is partly due to the traditional gender roles of that time, societal norms, and social influence all combined. So as we know, social influence is the effect that words, actions, or the mere presence of other people have on our thoughts, feelings, attitudes, or behavior. So within traditional gender roles of heterosexual couples in that time period, the man is usually the financial provider, while the female was in charge of cooking, taking care of the household, and childcare. And the women's rights movement was in the 60s, keep in mind, so that was fairly close to the LGBTQ rights movement, meaning that there was still a lot of people that could have carried the mindset that traditional gender roles should be in place. And we can still see this today. So to me, this wouldn't be just a topic of behaviorism, because behaviorism theory is an approach stating that to understand behavior, you only need to consider reinforcing properties of the environment. But this overlooks how people interpret their environment or construals. And this comes into play with the stereotypes that were circulating, mainly about lesbians, which was that they were cold and competent as in can-do spirit, powerful, and mostly dominant, just dominant. And this really went against the traditional factor that women should be warm, friendly, inviting, and that would make people want to get to know them or associate with them. And that is a part of the implicit personality theory or spontaneous trait inference, which is more of an automatic processing. And it also comes from the schema that lesbians acted, or might not have acted, but were stereotyped to act, that they hated men or anyone who wasn't an ally, which led to the changing of behavior towards them before even getting a real first impression from them. The tripartite model also applies here, because behaviorally opposers may not have engaged in homosexual acts themselves. Effectively, they may have valued traditional gender roles of heterosexuality and may have cognitively had opinions and attitudes where they disagreed or disliked gay people. And this also leads to the formation of schemas, which helps form attitudes instantaneously. Religion and culture were also major factors in the opposition of LGBTQ rights, because religion was used as a major argument, since in many religions, homosexuality is looked at as a sin. So this would be the general propaganda that some of the opposers would use. And culture also has a big influence on societal norms in the ways that we see relationships and marriage, expression of self, individualistic versus collectivistic mindsets, family dynamics, and so on and so forth. So, to reiterate, around this time, traditional marriages and families were common, and expression of self had really just begun to be emphasized within society, with the number of movements that had took place before the LGBT or gay rights movement. So now we can look at how these attitudes and schemas change so quickly and how they can continue to change in the future. And the main way of doing this is by reducing prejudice and reducing aggression. So prejudice can be caused by the minimal group paradigm, where we create groups or schemas based on the smallest possible details we notice about each other. It can also be a result of normative influence within social learning theory, because you can be influenced by how society treats minorities, which would be LGBTQ community in this instance, and how society expects one to act. So as public authority figures, celebrities, and the media began showing that they were accepting of the LGBTQ community, more people began to become more accepting as well and started changing their attitudes. And this could also be looked at as social conformity. To further reduce prejudice, One could apply the contact hypothesis, where more contact between groups, such as homosexuals and homophobic people, reduces prejudice and bias against each other. The other aspect, aggression towards the LGBTQ community, was treated as socially acceptable in those times. So more people would be violent towards gay people because they most likely were desensitized to it, seeing it all around them, and decided that since others did it, they could do it too, which is an act of disinhibition. So to reduce aggression, empathy training would be necessary, and it was likely used during that period of transitioning societal norms. Political activists emphasized that members of the LGBTQ community were humans too, that deserve to be loved freely and loved freely, which is an argument highlighting empathy and compassion. And this, we know, reduces aggression because empathy is an incompatible response to aggression. So that can still be used today to change the attitudes, because as we know, some people still do hold those prejudices and aggression towards the gay community. They also use the notion that children would be influenced by things like gay media and implementing gay history into schools. I didn't really get into that in this presentation because of how big of a debate it is, but just know that that is something that is also looked at. But yeah, that's my presentation on how social influence really affects LGBTQ rights. And the rest of my slides are just references and image sources. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk.